My first experience of what I would now refer to as cranial work, I would know it now as cranial work. Back then, I didn't know what was going on. I lived with a Buddhist monk when I was at university. He was studying their Western religions. And every so often, somebody would come and see him about their health problems and what have you. And what he did is he laid them down with their head on a pillow in his lap, and he held their head. He just put his hands around their head, and he would sit there kind of and smiling. And I said, why do people, they come to you with this stuff? I mean, do they all have headaches or what? And he said, oh, no, there's all sorts of things. And I said, well, what are you doing? Why do people come back? Why are people happy with this? I was in medical school. I had no idea what this was all about. To me, it just seemed like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, And Sampong would say, I'm shaking hands with chi, is what he would say. By which he meant he was somehow tuning into the kind of underlying energy of the body. What in Oriental language is called chi, and which I think in the West we would call life force or spirit. Something very similar. And I didn't know it at the time, but a lot of people would come to him, and they all seemed to be satisfied. He never was able to explain it to me, at least not in English. And then, some years later, I was doing part of my residency in a big hospital, and I saw an article that was laying there in the sort of staff room, written by a guy, William Garner Sutherland. And he had got this idea that the skull and the body had this kind of inherent natural rhythm. And he was leaving articles around, for young doctors and whatever, and students like me to read and to sort of, to pick our interest up a little bit in this kind of thing, to pull us away a little bit from the whole sort of chemical, technological side of things, I suppose. And I read this, but couldn't make much sense out of it. But something did stick with me, that whole notion of how some of the sutras are obviously designed to move. And nature doesn't do things, in a superfluous way. If something is designed to move, it should move, etc. So that was my second little exposure. And that was way back in the 1960s. And then eventually, when I came to cranial work for my own reasons, in my practice and also for my own health, I came to cranial work. I got more interested in it as a concept and as an idea. And I read an article by a midwife written, I think, during the Second World War. And she talked about how midwives used to be trained in what they called shaping, which was just shaping up babies' heads after they were born. If the overlap between the bones was not resolving, or if if the head and face weren't kind of bouncing back properly, after a day or two, then they would put their hands on the baby's head, and in the description in her article, and just gently sort of shape it out, the way you would sort of shape your hands around a sculpture. And that was an article called Shaping, and that was my next exposure to it. And that made good sense to me. Because you see, I grew up on a farm, I grew up with animals, on a ranch with horses and everything, and I saw lots of births. And when a colt didn't get up right away, after being born, the mare would lick the back of its head, sometimes for hours. Well after licking up all the amniotic juice and everything, long after the colt was dry and fluffy, she'd still be licking the back of the head and nuzzling the head, not paying any attention to any of the other parts of the body, just the head. And if that failed, then the colt was dead. But sometimes a little colt like that would revive. Sometimes we'd ring the vet and get the vet out as well to see if we could get the colt revived. And of course, they would inject adrenaline into the colt. But I saw this in action, and I sort of said, yeah, that's what they're doing. They're sort of doing that similar thing as humans. And then I came to study cranial and learn more about it. And I'm sure it has other roots around different cultures and so on. as well. But those were the things that sort of influenced me. The modern history is that in the recent decades, it's become a kind of a discipline in its own right, because quite a few Sutherland and other people had originally trained in osteopathic medicine, which is a kind of a manipulative form of body work. If something is out, you put it right. You give it a good click and try to get the joint back into its proper space. And coming from that osteopathic tradition, the cranial approach gradually sort of invaded that discipline. The cranial approach is very different. It's not manipulative. It's working more with the body. As opposed to putting it right, we tend to hold it in such a way that we mirror back the pressures to the body, so that it becomes aware, in its own inner wisdom, it becomes aware of how it's holding itself. And particularly this applies to the nervous system. You can't manipulate the nervous system. And in fact, manipulation doesn't work very well around the head either, because the sutures are not designed to take it. And that's not the kind of thing you normally find in the head. So it tends to respond to this shaping, this kind of indirect approach that we use in cranial work. And in recent decades, then, it's become its own discipline. It's moved away from the manipulative therapies a little bit. It's become a kind of an adjunct for many different disciplines. Dentists are studying it in quite large numbers now, particularly those dental students who want to do orthodontics. They would like to be able to shape up kids' heads and palates and jaws and stuff before it becomes such a problem that you have to use bracing, which of course would be equivalent to the sort of osteopathic approach. If it's out, put it right. Whereas the prior cranial approach is work with it and work with it and work with it until it starts to spring back of its own natural tendency. And it's found a home as well in veterinary medicine, because animals, and of course babies, people who can't speak, respond to it very well. And particularly with panic, again, shock and alarm. Horses respond beautifully to cranial work, for example, quite often saving the owners a great deal of money. So these days, all sorts of practitioners from many different fields take it up. Chiropractors and osteopaths, of course, physiotherapists, some doctors, pediatric nurses, midwives, dentists, vets, people who do massage therapy and aromatherapy. People who like hands-on work tend to do really well with cranial, and it becomes an adjunct in their work. So that even if it's appropriate sometimes to manipulate something and get it back into place, which sometimes it is, cranial work helps to ripen that and sustain that. Because the cranial work will take a look at that lesion that keeps popping out in relationship to the whole person, the whole body, and look at what's sustaining that lesion, what's bringing that lesion back time and time and time again, whether it's a hip or a spinal lesion or something in the head or face or whatever. So the recent history has been very much making its own discipline. And it's now taught in many countries, and there's many thousands of practitioners, all from those different fields, taking it up essentially as a postgraduate option. And it takes a fresh look, I think, at how we can help healing in ourselves and other people, how we can facilitate that without pretending that we know best, but rather just asking the body to find its own wisdom, to find its own shape within that.